So today we're going to talk about trauma and how trauma informs our relationships. Now, you may have already done this work. You may already be aware of some of these things. You may be new to this concept. But either way, I'm hoping that what I'm going to share today is going to give you something to think about in terms of your own self-awareness and your own ability to stop any historical traumatic events from impacting your relationship or your marriage. I want to talk about what trauma is. I want to talk about what does it do to our brain, how it shows up in our relationship. So what are some signs and some really common characteristics of trauma and how it plays out in our relationships, what those patterns of behavior are, and then a few things that we can do to start the process of healing trauma. Healing trauma, it can be more of a lengthy process. It takes less time to acknowledge and recognize trauma than it does to actually heal from trauma. But what I've discovered in this process of, in my own work and in supporting clients in their work and the research that I've done on this is that it's actually not as hard as it seems. Because once you make that shift in recognizing what it actually is and how it's impacting us, if we can tune into self-love and compassion and recognizing that we can heal it, knowing we can actually heal trauma. There is nobody that I've met that hasn't had some kind of trauma. So this is going to lead me into the definition of trauma. I think a lot of times we think of trauma as like, you've only had trauma if you were on the front lines of war and you watched your friends get killed, or if you yourself were shot, or if you were sexually abused or raped, or, you were witnessing somebody getting beat up, things like that are like really obvious traumatic events. But really what trauma is it just means a wound that has been unprocessed. So the word trauma itself is a Greek word and it means wound. And it's not the pain of the wound, it's what happens as a result of the wound and what it does to our self-concept and the meaning that we then make about relationships, life, the world, our own safety, trust, those kinds of core beliefs, and how our brain is impacted by trauma. So pain, when we look at, if we go through some kind of painful event, like let's say we lose a family member, that in and of itself can be not traumatic. It can be deeply sad. It can be devastating in terms of the loss, and it can be acutely painful for a very long time. And in fact, it could be painful for the rest of your life, but that's not the same thing as trauma. Trauma is when the pain is not supported, when you don't get the support to process or metabolize the pain. So it's really when it's been left unhealed, or you weren't in an environment where the pain of that wounding can actually be healed properly. When you think about even just like a wound on your skin, if it's not healed properly, the scar tissue makes the skin is never the same again. I personally, that belief or that expression that says, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, I don't think that's true. I think that what doesn't kill us wounds us and makes us less flexible in some ways. It hurts us and it makes us less resilient in a lot of ways, unless we can heal it, which there always is opportunities to heal it. Even if there was trauma that happened 30 years ago that you haven't processed, it's never too late. So that's the good news. But I want to get back into what trauma is. So like I said, trauma can be a deep and painful loss. If you were a child and you went through some pain, but you were alone and you didn't have anybody helping you name that experience, you were maybe there was some emotional neglect, not on purpose, but maybe your parents were busy, maybe they were surviving, maybe they were working 4 jobs and they were never around. Maybe somebody died in the family and they were in so much pain that they just weren't even attuned, right? So this isn't about blame. But we do know that the single biggest impact on the human brain is the first 7 years of life, and the parent-child relationship that we are in as a child is the single biggest predictor of how our brain is going to develop. So it's not about blaming the adults in our life, but it's just about understanding the impact that certain things could have. Even the best of parents, even present parents, may not know if you're going through something and it's overwhelming your ability to cope, and you're having some pain in your life that you're not able to even talk about. So you're alone in that pain. Does that make sense? It's not the pain itself that's the trauma. It's the inability to process it, the inability to cope with it, because of whatever your developmental stage is. So trauma by definition is actually very subjective. What would be traumatic to one person might not be traumatic to the other person, because it's going to depend on what their capacity is. It's going to depend on their level of sensitivity, just because, some people are more sensitive than others, and so it's not going to take as much to hurt those people or for them to feel pain. And it's going to have to do with that person's ability to cope through community, through a loving space, through the developmental stage where they'll be able to actually name their experience, to talk about it, to know what they're feeling. And if that's not processed or metabolized, as they say, then it kind of just goes into the body and it bypasses our conscious mind entirely. And then it can inform the rest of our lives when we don't even know it, right? And then it comes out in relationships. And then if you're listening to this right now, you're probably somebody that resonates with this idea of trauma. Maybe you think that your spouse has trauma. Maybe you yourself know that you might have had trauma, and you're just at the beginning stages of understanding this might still be living in me and is impacting my relationships. So the other thing I want to mention about trauma too is that it's not just a single event. So, because there's different kinds of trauma, and complex trauma is actually a series of events. So complex trauma can be exposure to multiple traumatic events across time. It can be consistent emotional neglect. It can be repeatedly witnessing violence or abuse. It can be, even if you were taken from your parents and you were put into the foster system and you were bounced around, right? And you're being exposed to chronic transition, chronic instability, even just living in poverty, even if you have the best of parents, can be a form of trauma. So through just the repeated experience of not having enough is a form of trauma too. And what it does to your brain is it changes your neural networks in your brain. It changes your neuroplasticity. It changes how your brain actually develops physiologically, but it also changes the way that you make meaning and the beliefs, the core beliefs that you develop. Ruptures in connection, abandonment, chaos, all of those things will impact how we learn automatically, and we all have like a default way of making meaning, a default way of deciding why something is the way that it is, or why we're experiencing what we're experiencing, or what it means about us. We have these default ways that we might not even be conscious of, but we just are making assumptions about that. And in doing this personal work and in doing relational healing, we start to get clear and like conscious of, this is what I'm thinking. This is the assumption that I'm making that I didn't even know I was making all these years. So this is the power of doing this work. But first we have to recognize that for example, if something happens when we're little, what children tend to do is they tend to make it about themselves. If, you've heard the thing like, if my parents get divorced, it must be my fault. And we know that that's not possible. How is that possible? It can't be a child's fault. It doesn't make sense. But to the child, that's the only way that they have to make meaning out of it. It must be related to me. And so because honestly, I think humans tend to feel like it's easier to think that it's our fault than it is to feel that we are powerless. And that bad things can happen to us no matter how good we are, no matter how right we are, no matter how lovable we are. We're never immune from bad things happening. We can never escape living life on life's terms. And that's sort of terrifying in an existential way for humans, is to feel that powerless over things outside of our control that can impact us so deeply. So it's almost better. It's sort of like this delusion of control to feel like, it's my fault, therefore I can control things. I can protect myself if I'm just better, or if I just don't do these things, or if I put this mask on and pretend to be someone that I'm not. Whatever it is, we can control it. And that's my sense of why that happens. And we have to just be really aware that default mode of relating, that default way of making meaning, is the very thing that gets impacted by trauma. This can be like the way that we make meaning and the way that those first 7 years develop can be positive too. And all the really wonderful positive experiences, all of us have protective factors too. All of us have good experiences that we can look back and say, thank goodness I had this in place in my life, because that allowed me to assume the best in certain areas, or that allowed me to recognize these strengths in myself. And a lot of the good things that we have in our lives right now are an outcome of that. But today we're just talking about the negative impact of trauma on our relationships. So it might seem like this is a really one-sided thing, but that's really the focus of this conversation today. So an example of some core beliefs that you can get damaged in trauma is that it must be my fault. I have to be a certain way to be safe, thus the masking that I was just talking about. People can't be trusted. I'm not lovable. Or once people find out the truth about me, they won't love me anymore. I have to hide my feelings in order to stay connected. I can't be truly authentic. I can't say how I'm really feeling without losing connection. I can't be honest or I'll be hurt, which is another variation of that same thing. And these are the core beliefs that will dictate the rest of your life, and they'll impact your significant, especially your primary relationships. A lot of us can keep this at bay at work or with friendships, but once we get close to someone who's our primary person, the stakes are highest, and that's when this stuff comes out the most. So how does this show up? Now, in terms of the way that it comes, like if you're wondering, is this me? Is this happening in my relationship? Or if you wonder if your spouse is going through some of this, there are some patterns of behavior that are associated with trauma. Number one is that we don't really know or trust what is safe. So there's a lot, especially when we've had like chronic trauma, lots of chaos growing up, and chronic trauma, or like complex trauma, like I mentioned before, you wouldn't feel familiar with a sense of well-being and safety. It's just not familiar to you. What's more familiar is to live in sort of unpredictability. And that allows us to normalize toxic behaviors. It allows us to normalize boundary violations. That's just what we know. And the human brain is wired to gravitate towards what feels most familiar. We want to stick with what we know because that's going to keep us the safest, right? Anything that is unknown is inherently dangerous to the biological part of the human brain. And if we don't know, and if we don't have that sense of healthy boundaries, and if we've normalized toxic behaviors, sometimes we won't know what's what. We won't know whose is who. So if there's a problem in the relationship, we will disproportionately take ownership over something that's actually on their side of the street. As a way of trying to fix it. Or on the flip side, we will be in victim mode because we were victims of, trauma, but now we're carrying that with us in our core beliefs, and we're looking for that, and we're reliving that even in a situation where it wouldn't warrant that. So the flip side of that would be saying it's their fault for everything, right? It's all their fault. If they hadn't done this, I wouldn't have done this. And giving them, so we either take too much power and ownership, and we're living on both sides of the street and blurring the boundaries that way, or we're putting it all on them and we're giving away our power. Those are really common default modes that come from trauma. Sometimes not even knowing, like, I don't know who's responsible for this. I don't know where the line is. I don't know whose side of the street this issue is even on. Not knowing, like, that can be very confusing. So like issues of codependency, right, fall under this category. Whose problem is this? It seems like they're having a problem, and I'm talking to them about their problem, but they're telling me that there's no problem, but I know that there is, and I can feel it, and they're just not being honest with me. But now I'm upset about it, and now I'm responding to that upset in a way that they experience to be crossing the line. And we are standing here saying, but it's them, right? It's their problem. Well, that might be where it started, but now it's your problem. Because it's impacted you, you have feelings about it, but you're not owning your feelings, you're talking about theirs. It gets blurry, right? And this is super common. So this is more, I would say, and I think our culture at large promotes codependency, but I think that what I'm talking about right now is one of the most common outcomes of complex trauma, or growing up in chaotic environments, or growing up in environments where there was emotional neglect. And neglect is a strong word. It could be that our caregivers or parents, nobody did that for them, and they don't even know what their own feelings are. So how are they going to be able to hold space for yours, right? Again, not about blame. The second thing that happens as a result of trauma in all its forms is not being able to trust others, not feeling safe. So there's this pervasive feeling of anxiety. There's this pervasive feeling of fear. There's an experience of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Not trusting, like that if you open up to the other person, that they're not going to hurt you with that information. It's the feeling of, I'm not going to open up and be totally vulnerable. I'm not going to show all my cards. I'm not going to share what's really behind the curtain because that doesn't feel safe. I can't be really vulnerable. And so there's masking, right? There's being somewhat dishonest, not lying per se, but maybe being in a little bit of denial about what you're actually feeling, and then it comes out sideways. And then also, one thing that results from this lack of trust is keeping one foot out the door. Is sort of like, I'm not going to put all my eggs in your basket. You're who I want to be with. You're my person. I love you and I care about you. But I'm not going to show everything to you because that would be so terrifying. So I'm going to keep one foot out the door. I'm going to keep a little bit of distance. Or I'm going to behave in a way like that will evoke in you the feelings that I have. Like if I'm jealous because I don't trust, I'm going to behave in ways that will bring out your jealousy and lack of trust so that I can point the finger at you and say, you don't trust me, what's your problem? When really I'm the one that's not trusting, right? So those are all things that can come from that. The third thing is hypervigilance. So this is being on alert at all times and never being able to settle in, never being able to enjoy peace, never being able to enjoy things actually being really good, not trusting that they are actually good, feeling like there must be something lurking. It's like pessimism. It's expecting the worst. It's knowing that I'm not going to assume the best because I'm only going to get disappointed. And you become a wet blanket. You rain on your partner's parade and you're not allowed to live in joy. I remember hearing Brene Brown talk about joy being actually the hardest emotion for a lot of humans to hold. And I think that there's something to that. Like being in joy and just being in peace is terrifying because if we have had trauma in our life and we are in a place of hypervigilance as a way of surviving, our tentacles are always out. Our radar is always on, looking for evidence of danger. Sort of like, I think of like the mountain on the lion sleeping with one eye open, kind of just making sure, like you always have to kind of be awake to what might come in the dark if you're not careful. So don't relax too much. Don't enjoy yourself too much. You got to be on the lookout. That's the hypervigilance. And that gets translated as pessimism. It gets translated as negative cognition, always looking at the glass half empty. Because if you look at the glass half full, you might not be safe. That's really what it comes down to. The fourth thing is being in survival mode. Now, this is related to what I just said, but this is a little bit different. This is when we go into fight or flight or freeze. And then there's fawning. Fawning response is also considered a survival mode. So this is obviously fighting is when you go into I'm going to attack. Flight is I have to flee. I have to get out of here. I have to just run out the room, right? And then there's freeze, which is just like almost like shutdown, where you can't. It's a fear response. You just can't think. You can't act. You can't access the prefrontal cortex of your brain. You can't think straight, and you feel overwhelmed, and so you just go into shutdown. And then the fawning response is just trying to make sure, because you feel that your safety is dependent on the well-being of the other person, and so you're fawning over them. You're like overly caretaking them and making sure that they're okay, so that you can be okay. And that can happen from being a parentified child, where you feel like you're having to caretake your parents. You want to try to do all that you can to make them feel okay, so that they will be available to you, because your survival depends on it. But what I'm talking about is when you're an adult and you are chronically in survival mode. How this shows up, it looks like, because survival mode, I mean, we all have fight or flight. We all have that capacity, and that's to protect us, but we're not supposed to live there. Survival mode, how you know that you're in that is when your reaction is disproportionate to the trigger. Whatever it is that set you off, whatever it is that activated that feeling in you, your response is disproportionate. There's a lot of reactivity, there's a lot of explosiveness, a lot of being really scared when there's actually technically nothing to be afraid of. Like, you're not going to get hurt, you're going to be okay, but it doesn't feel that way to your body. So maybe you've had that experience where you're like, I know I should just say something, or I know that I'm not unsafe, but when I think about saying this or when I think about doing something, every cell in my body is telling me that I shouldn't do it because I don't trust it. I don't feel safe. That's the survival mode. And if we're in self-protection all the time, we can't grow. Any organism, any cell in our body, any organ that we have, and our psyches as well, our whole beings, if we are constantly protecting, we can't grow and expand. We cannot do both at the same time. So it's important to be able to recognize that, notice that, and create a life where you really feel pretty sure, like, okay, I've got safe people in my life. We can never protect against adverse events forever and ever, right? Like I said, there's just too many variables outside of our control. But if we are choosing healthy people, if we are taking care of ourselves, if we trust ourselves to put ourselves in safe situations and to know and to trust ourselves to know when boundaries are being crossed or when things are not safe, then we don't have to be on the lookout all the time. We know I've got that when the time comes. But in the meantime, I don't need to be planning for disaster. I've got what it takes if the disaster comes. But in the meantime, I'm going to enjoy my life, because when the disaster comes 5 years from now, I don't want to feel like I missed the last 5 years preparing for it when I could have had a good 5 years up until that point in time, right? So that's the thing. That's the survival mode piece. And then finally, a thing that comes up a lot in trauma survivors is addiction. There's a massive correlation between trauma and addiction. And I'm not just talking about severe substance abuse, even though that's huge. Like, I think 95% of people with severe substance abuse addictions have had significant trauma in the form of either sexual abuse or being abused or profoundly neglected as a child. But today I'm not talking about just that. I'm talking about addiction, which is really any behavior that gives you temporary relief from stress or pain, and therefore you crave it, but then you suffer negative consequences as a result of it, and you have a hard time stopping it. By that definition, I would say most of us have some kind of addiction, whether it's, we're addicted to our phones, we're looking for that hit of dopamine, anything where you have the temporary relief craving that has negative consequences that you are that you're not able to give up despite of those negative consequences. That is addiction. So it could be substances, it could be sex or sex addiction, it could be gambling, it could be screen addictions, it could be anything that is self-medicating. Food is a big one too, right? So if you are constantly looking to soothe yourself through something that actually isn't serving your growth and expansion, I consider that an addiction. And if you have that, if your partner has that, even though you're not able to recognize where it came from, it's a really big red flag. It's a really great place to ask yourself that question. What is it that lives in me that I'm trying to find relief from? How often did I feel that way growing up? And what is happening in my relationship right now that is activating that? Is it something I'm bringing to the table? Is it something that they're bringing to the table? Once you do the relationship work, you can see where the boundary is, and then you know whose is whose, but just start by asking that question. You don't have to know the answers, but you want to really ask that question. What is it that I'm trying to find relief from? What is this in me? It's unresolved pain. And see, this is the whole thing that I was talking about earlier with trauma. We're not going to ever heal from it unless we've metabolized the pain. And that means actually feeling it, facing it, and getting more uncomfortable before you can get more comfortable. It's that old adage, things get worse before they get better. We're going to get more uncomfortable before we're going to get comfortable and actually heal what was never properly healed. You can put a mask over the pain, but if you've not healed it, it's going to continue to come out sideways. It's going to continue to inform your relationship. So now we're going to talk about what do you have to actually do to heal it? Because this is the hard part, right? So many people that I talk to have really good insight and they recognize all of this already. They might have already been in therapy for years. They might already know exactly, I know where this comes from. I know how this plays out. I recognize it. I watch it play out. but I can't seem to stop it. No amount of insight in the world is going to help me change it. What do I do? So the first thing we have to do to heal it is and this is especially if you're engaging in some kind of addiction or any kind of protective behaviors to defend against the pain, you want to ask yourself, like, what is it that this is doing for me? What is the secondary gain that this has? This is a little bit counterintuitive, but if engaging in the addiction is going to soothe the pain, if it's going to make you feel closer to people, it's going to help you feel more relaxed, less fearful, if it's going to give you a sense of control or escape the stress, you could look at that as a valid way of dealing with pain. Like, it's not something you want to continue, but it's something that you recognize there's a reason for it. How can I look at this compassionately? This is something that serves a purpose. This is a survival skill that I learned. This is a coping skill that I learned when I didn't know any better, and then it became a habit. So if you can first just look at that really compassionately and realize that the things that you're doing and these patterns of behavior that come from these traumas served a purpose to protect you, then you're not at a war or a battle that side of you. You know, my clients know this expression, adaptive child. The adaptive child is the wounded child's version of the adult trying to protect itself. Like, the adaptive child is like the part of the child's psyche that's coming in saying, I'm going to act like a grown-up and protect the wounded part of me. Well, that adaptive child just did what it had to do. And if you can look at that and go, I don't have to hate that part of me. I can honor it, and I can have empathy, and I have compassion. I can thank that part of me, and I can say, thank you so much for helping me survive. Thank you so much for trying to support me, for trying to keep me safe. And acknowledge the suffering that you had to be in to do that. Like, for you to learn these coping skills that are no longer serving you, these maladaptive coping skills like an addiction, there was a lot of pain that you had to be in for that to happen. So just try to have empathy for yourself, put your arms around yourself, figuratively, and just express care and understanding and give yourself some self-love. That's the first thing. Then you want to, from a place of self-love, because if we're in resistance, if we're in a place of judgment and we try to change something about ourselves that we're in judgment of, it's way harder. It's way harder to change it. It's much easier to change something about ourselves from a place of love and acceptance, because acceptance is the starting point for all transformation. I don't know why that is. I can't explain it, but it just is. If you accept it and you love on that part of you, but then you put that part of you in the back seat and you say, I got this from here. That's so much better than trying to throw that part of you away or just try to kill that part of you, because it is a part of you, and you can't be trying to destroy a part of you that actually was there to help you survive. You have to integrate it. So that's the first thing. Then you want to notice how the limiting beliefs that came from the wounding are impacting you. What are your limiting beliefs? Are you aware of what those are? If you aren't aware of what those are, how you can tell is if you look at something in your life that you say you don't want, but that is still there. The printout of your life is evidence of what your beliefs are. Even if you say you don't want it, there's a part of your psyche that believes that that is what you want, or believes that that's what you deserve, or believes that that is the only thing that's possible. So look at the printout of your life. If there's anything that is something that you really don't like, that you say, this is not in alignment with my values, this is not in alignment with my goals, but yet it persists and it's something that I'm participating in actively every single day, there's a limiting belief there. They usually come down to three categories: competency, worthiness, and safety. We're talking about trauma today, so a lot of the limiting beliefs are going to come down to safety. Is it safe to share my genuine feelings? Is it safe to stretch beyond the place I'm at right now? Is it safe to give my heart to someone? Is it safe to show what's behind the curtain, right? Though that's usually what comes up. But ask yourself, like, is there a worthiness piece? Have you internalized a core belief that you're not worthy, that you're not deserving, that you're not capable? That's the competency piece. Or you can also look at core beliefs that are related to your willingness. Maybe you have beliefs around, like, that's not something that I'm capable of, but it's also not something that I'm willing to do, because you might have a limiting belief about what that means about you that needs to be changed. Changing beliefs is hard because they feel really, really true, especially if they were ingrained in us in the first 7 years of our life. They feel like they're hardwired in as truth. And a lot of times people will say to me, and I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. People will say, how can I just pick new beliefs? Isn't that just telling myself a lie? And I always say, well, maybe what you first believed was true was a lie. Maybe that was what the lie was. It's not any less arbitrary. Those were arbitrary. Those were just downloaded into you before you even had a choice. Now you can choose and you can recondition, and whatever you believe is what you start to live. That's true. That if you start to really believe differently, you start to think differently, you will start to be different energetically, and you will start to behave differently just in terms of the mechanics of your day-to-day life. How you communicate, what moves you make in the pattern with your spouse or your partner, how you respond, what your default mode is, all of that changes in accordance with your beliefs. So that's the big thing. You have to look at what negative beliefs, what limiting beliefs came from my trauma, and what do I need to replace those beliefs with, and you can recondition those. Now, and it's really, I wanted to mention this too, you have to disidentify from those beliefs. So not just observe that you're having those beliefs, but to separate yourself from them completely and recognize these beliefs are not me. These beliefs are just in me, and by naming them and identifying them, now they are outside of me, and now I have more control over them. But if we don't name them, we can't disidentify from them. If we don't acknowledge them as something we have, it will feel as though they have us, and we won't be able to separate ourselves from them. So we have to disidentify from those beliefs. The next thing we have to do is we have to make a decision to heal. We have to choose a modality, and we have to decide, I'm not going to let this affect me anymore, and I'm going to get the help that I need. Now, some people do EMDR. I love EMDR. I think EMDR is a really powerful trauma modality because it doesn't require you to do talk therapy, which a lot of talk therapy, it stays in the frontal cortex. It's right in the frontal lobe of your brain, and that's not how we process and heal trauma. Because it's in the body, so we have to feel the feelings, or we have to be able to get to a place where we can remember the trauma without getting activated by the trauma. And that means getting into a whole brain state, activating both hemispheres of the brain at the same time. That can come through bilateral stimulation, through hypnotherapy, through EMDR and NLP. There's a lot of modalities that will get you in a whole brain state, that will allow you to process trauma without having to talk about it and without even having to relive it. You don't have to relive it. You just have to be able to view it, to remember it in a way that doesn't activate you. It's really powerful, and it doesn't take that long to do it. So it's EMDR. You can Google it if you're not familiar. There's also other trauma-based therapies. There's somatic healing. Some people now, there's more research that's being done around the use of therapeutic psychedelics that are helping people. I personally don't know a lot about that, but I know a lot of people have been able to have breakthroughs in their trauma work with that kind of therapy. So I'm just giving you these ideas. You guys have to find what works for you, and you can research this on your own. But the point I'm trying to make is you have to decide that you're willing to face it. You have to decide to be willing to look at it and to go there, right? It doesn't mean you're going to spend years in psychoanalysis. I don't recommend psychoanalysis for trauma. And I don't recommend even just traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, unless cognitive behavioral therapy is helpful, but not if you're only using your cognition. If it's just talk therapy, you have to find a modality that will allow you to, like I said, integrate both hemispheres of the brain at the same time. Those tend to be more alternative, quote unquote. They're not going to be 10 years from now. These are going to be standard. Like EMDR used to be considered very fringe. Now it's like mainstream. A lot of the trauma-based modalities and the somatic therapies that are coming out now are also going to be mainstream in like 10 years. That's what I predict. Because emotions are in the body, and we have to be able to actually feel those emotions, or at least acknowledge them and name them and recognize the impact that they've had, rather than just burying it and trying to bypass it. We cannot bypass trauma. if we want to heal from it. Then you have to be willing to be who you really are. So this is the piece about authenticity. This is about putting down your mask, because, and this is connected to the self-love piece that I talked about in the first point, you have to be willing to say the truth of what you really feel, what you really think, what you really felt, what you really experienced, which is scary, because if you were alone in dealing with trauma, you might have been told that you're making a mountain out of a molehill. You might have been told by a family member who went through the same thing that you went through, and for them it wasn't a trauma. And so then you're second guessing yourself. You have to be willing to actually speak the truth of who you are and reconnect with yourself and take off that mask. And you just getting honest with yourself is really hard. It's actually harder than it sounds. And even for those of us who have done a lot of work, might catch ourselves thinking, oh yeah, no, that's not true. I thought this was true, but it's actually this. You have to go a little bit deeper and say, is that really true for me? Is what I'm saying right now really true for me? Or am I spinning it just a little bit so that it's more palatable to myself and my own self-concept, or so that it's more palatable to my loved ones because I'm afraid of losing connection? When you can be authentic, 100% authentic, and take that chance, because it's really disappointing if you're authentic and you're really honest and you share, and then somebody doesn't respond in a way that feels nurturing or supportive. But if you realize that your safety no longer hinges on that, you are safe right now, that just because somebody's behaving in a way that triggers the old memory doesn't mean you're actually in the same situation, and you are not unsafe now. Someone else's lack of understanding can't actually make you unsafe. I'm always talking about emotional safety, so this might seem like a little bit of a contradiction. But at the most fundamental level, when we know that someone else's lack of understanding can't really hurt us, it can make us feel sad and disappointed, and we can feel loss about that, but there will be someone who does understand. You just have to find the right person, and your partner might not be the person that you process trauma with. That's why I'm saying you want to get somebody to help you with that. Now, in a relationship where both people are doing the work, I think a lot of times couples can do it together and be each other's safe container. But if your spouse doesn't feel like a safe container for you yet, either because they haven't done the work and they're not conscious enough to be safe, or because you just don't trust it yet and you're just not at the point where you can take that chance, that's okay. Just know that about yourself and get the help so that you do have that safe container. You have to find at least one person that you can be completely honest about what your real experience is. Sometimes just having that mirror, that sounding board, helps you reconnect with your authentic self. It's exhausting to wear a mask. It's exhausting to feel like you have to put up a front, and I think most people have that on some level, and it just takes so much energy. Once you let that down, there's such a freedom to be had, and all of that energy that has gone into protecting yourself, imagine if that was freed up to grow and expand and live the life you want to live. It's literally like just unlocking a massive amount of energy that we waste in protecting ourselves because we're still unprocessed from something that happened 20 years ago. And it's not logical, right? It's not logical to spend that much energy on something that is over. But the only way that we can make it truly over for ourselves is to be honest with ourselves, to love ourselves, to make peace with the part of us that was trying to protect ourselves, and to make that decision to process the trauma once and for all. People avoid this like the plague. People avoid it and avoid it and avoid it because people don't want to go there. And I get it. There's a lot at stake. Not only do we have to be uncomfortable, but we also might have to admit something we didn't want to admit. If we need to believe that we had a happy childhood, we need to believe that we need to believe something that isn't true, really, in order to feel like a whole person, then it's going to feel extremely threatening to do this work. So you just have to remember, though, that it's not like you're going to lose your identity. You're only going to lose your false identity. You're only going to lose one aspect, one incomplete part of your identity. Your new identity, your more whole, healed identity, is going to come from, part of my identity is what I learned to survive. And I love that about myself. I love my grit. I love my tenacity. I love my ability to keep myself safe. I love my ability to detect danger. I'm so grateful for that part of me. And now I'm going to get really honest with other parts of me, the more vulnerable parts of me, the more scared parts of me, the more damaged parts of me. But once you can do that, as hard as it is, once you can do that, you are free. You are free to truly turn the page. So the past is no longer informing you going forward. And that means that your relationship can be so much better. You don't have to play out whatever patterns you've had in your marriage. If you've had them for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, they can stop. You can stop those patterns just by healing your own trauma. You don't even need your partner to join you in that. If you know that your trauma is playing a part in your entrenched patterns with your spouse, and all you do is heal your own trauma, you're going to transform your marriage and your relationship. Either because they're going to grow in response, or you're going to unlock the dance that you do, and they're going to be free to grow in a new direction too, or they're going to be inspired by your growth, and now your marriage is going to be good and healthy. Or you're going to grow and you're going to realize, I can't have a healthy relationship with this person because they're stuck in their toxic patterns and they're not willing to heal, and I'm not willing to be in such a close relationship with somebody who's not healed because it compromises my healing. And then you might decide you have a hard decision to make, right? So, but no matter what the outcome is, you get yourself back, and there's nothing better than that. So that's it for my chat. That's it for my little talk. I want to check in with you guys and see if you have any questions about any of this.